File transfer complete.
This is the Arizona Podcast. Stories about the people, places, and events found along the highways and back roads of the Grand Canyon State. For more information on our podcast, visit ArizonaPodcast.com.
And welcome to Arizona Route 66, the podcast. I'm Christopher, and as we celebrate the centennial of the Mother Road, I wanted to share with you the humble beginnings. When you drive Route 66 today, the road feels inevitable, like it was always going to be here, like someone looked at a map and drew the obvious line from Chicago to Los Angeles and said, yes, that one. But that's not what happened. You see, the road that became the most beloved highway in the world was fought over before it even existed, barely funded when it did, and sadly held together in places by little more than good intentions and lots of gravel. Here in Arizona specifically, the terrain pushed back hard. The money was never enough, and the gap between what was promised on paper and what drivers actually found when they got here was, well, significant enough to be dangerous. That's the story of how Route 66 got built, or more accurately, how it almost didn't, is worth sharing. Cyrus Avery wanted US 60. That was his number. An east-to-west highway running from Virginia to Los Angeles, and he wanted Oklahoma and his territory sitting right in the middle of it. Kentucky and Virginia had other ideas. They wanted US 60 for their own east-to-west route. And they had enough political muscle to win that fight. Avery lost. He was handed 66 as a consolation, and by most accounts, he wasn't happy about it. Think about that for a second. The number that became synonymous with American freedom and open road was Cyrus Avery's second choice. The name that Bobby Troup would one day sing about. The number that would end up on t-shirts and coffee mugs and tattoos around the world, even become synonymous with a podcast, was the number that Avery settled on when he couldn't get the one he wanted. Now, there's something very Route 66 about that when you think about it. The political fights didn't stop at numbering. Getting states to commit funding was a battle at every turn. The federal government established the highway system, but the states were responsible for their own stretches of it. Arizona in the late 1920s was a young state with limited resources and vast distances to cover. Paving thousands of miles of desert highway wasn't at the top of anyone's priority list. When Route 66 was officially commissioned on November 11, 1926, large sections of it didn't even exist in any meaningful sense. What travelers found in many places was an improved dirt track, sometimes not even that. In Arizona, that meant crossing the high desert on surfaces that turned to mud in the summer monsoons and dust in the rest of the year. Washouts were common. Getting stuck wasn't an emergency. It was an expected part of the journey. The gap between what was promised and what existed wasn't a small one. The federal designation gave the road a number and a name. It didn't give it pavement. Arizona didn't even finish paving its entire stretch until 1938. 12 years after the road was officially established, there were still sections of dirt track in the state. The people who drove Route 66 in the early years weren't driving a finished highway. They were driving a promise, and in Arizona, that promise ran through some of the most unforgiving terrain in the American West. The Black Mountains and the open grade. This is the most dramatic engineering story on the entire Arizona stretch. The original alignment of Route 66 through Arizona ran west from Kingman up and over the Black Mountains through Sitgreaves Pass to Oatman and then down to the Colorado River at Tobacco. On a map, it looks pretty straightforward. On the ground, it was something else entirely. Sitgreaves Pass sits at 3,500 feet. The road climbing to it from Kingman and descending from it to Oatman was steep, narrow, and unforgiving. We're talking about grades of up to 15% in some places, sharp curves with no guardrails, drop-offs that gave early motorists a very clear view of what a mistake would actually cost them. Vehicles of the 1920s and 30s weren't built for this. Radiators boiled over on the climb. Brakes faded and sometimes failed on the descent. Travelers would stop on the grade to let engines cool. Some pushed cars up the steepest section by hand. And there are accounts of vehicles being driven in reverse up certain grades because reverse gear provided more torque than first gear. In summer, the heat made everything worse. The Mojave Desert on the other side of those mountains was already brutal. Adding a mountain grade to the beginning or the end of that crossing, well, it turned a difficult drive into a genuine ordeal. When a bypass was built through Yucca in 1952, that avoided the mountain crossing entirely. Now, most traffic took it immediately. And Oatman, which had survived as a gold mining town and then as a Route 66 stop, found itself off the main road overnight. The town nearly died before the interstate ever arrived. The bypass did to Oatman what the interstate would later do to Seligman. Now, the original alignment over Sitgreaves Pass still exists. I drive it normally. You can still do it today. The curves are still sharp. The views are still dramatic. And the burros still wander into the road in Oatman because, well, they know the traffic's slow enough that they can, well, pretty much own the place. But driving it now as a scenic experience and driving it then in the 1930s as your only option are two very different things. Keep in mind, funding Route 66 was a constant negotiation between federal priorities, state budgets, and local politics. Arizona wasn't unique in struggling with this, but the scale of the challenge here was significant. The state had hundreds of miles of highway to maintain across desert terrain that was so hard on the road surfaces. Summer heat expanded and cracked pavement. Flash floods washed out sections without any warnings. The infrastructure required to keep the road passable was ongoing and really expensive. Now, there are stretches of Arizona Route 66 where the pavement was laid, deteriorated, was patched, deteriorated again, and was essentially rebuilt multiple times before the interstate made the question moot. The road that travelers experienced in the 1930s and 40s wasn't a consistent surface. It varied mile by mile depending on when that section had last been worked on and what the county or state had available to spend. The towns along the route had a complicated relationship with this reality. Better roads meant more traffic, meant more business. But the towns didn't have control over the roads itself. They were dependent on state and federal decisions made by people who had never driven that stretch in question. Beyond the Black Mountains, Arizona presented other challenges that early road builders had to work around or through. Now, the stretch through the high desert between Flagstaff and the New Mexico border crossed terrain that flooded seasonally and froze in the winter. Flagstaff sits at 7,000 feet. Snow wasn't a rare event. It was a seasonal reality that closed sections of the road and, well, it stranded travelers who hadn't even planned for it. The Painted Desert and Petrified Forest region presented its own challenges. The soil in parts of the northeastern Arizona is a bentonite clay, which, well, it becomes extremely slippery when wet and can make road surfaces nearly impassable after rain. Early travelers learned to check the weather and wait when necessary. The crossing of the Colorado River required a bridge. The original crossing at Topak used an existing railroad bridge converted for vehicle traffic. It was narrow. It wasn't designed for the volume of traffic that Route 66 would eventually bring. Now, the current bridge replaced it, but the original crossing was another reminder that the infrastructure of Route 66 was built incrementally and imperfectly. Here's what strikes me about this history. The road that people romanticize today, the two-lane blacktop through the Arizona desert, the neon and the motor courts and the wide open spaces, was built under conditions that were generally difficult. The engineers and the work crews and the county road departments that laid this pavement were solving hard problems with limited resources in a very unforgiving terrain. And the travelers who drove it in those early decades weren't on a vacation road trip. They were navigating something they were still trying to figure out. The romance came later. The reality was gravel and heat in grades that tested every vehicle that attempted them. That history doesn't diminish what Route 66 became. If anything, it makes it more, pretty much remarkable. A road that was barely funded, fought over before it existed, and held together in places by determination and gravel, somehow became the most beloved highway in the world. This year, 2026, the road turns 100 years old. And Arizona, the state that didn't finish paving its stretch for 12 years after the road was established, now holds the longest continuous drivable stretch of the original Route 66 in the nation. There's something very satisfying about that. I traveled Arizona Route 66 in the summer of 1969 and saw everything from the back seat of a Chevy Bel Air station wagon. I remember everything. I remember every mile. I was captivated. It was, if it were Disneyland, the stretch you would use up all of your e-tickets. The Painted Desert, the Petrified Forest, the Wigwam Motel, the Meteor Crater, the Grand Canyon, the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world in Flagstaff, the Grand Canyon Caverns, Hoover Dam, Sitgreaves Pass, and the Burrows of Oatman. It was all there. I remember it like yesterday. Hey, thanks for spending some time with me on the road. If you've got a story from the Arizona stretch, a town you love, or a stretch of the road that means something to you, reach out to us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at ArizonaPodcast.com or drop us an email. And you'll find us at Let'sTalk@ArizonaPodcast.com. Until next time, travel well, my friends.
Program terminated. Thank you for listening to the Arizona Podcast. For more information on our podcasts, the people, places, events, or the sponsors heard, visit ArizonaPodcast.com. Available for download everywhere.